My name is Walter Calder. I am 74 years old, and 3 days ago, I stood in my own kitchen doorway and watched my daughter go quiet the second she saw me. She'd been on the phone. I only caught the tail end of it, just get the paperwork ready. He won't even notice before she smiled at me like nothing had happened and asked if I wanted eggs. I said sure. I sat down. I drank my coffee. And I said nothing at all. That's the part nobody understands about me. I don't raise my voice, never have. My wife, Margaret, used to say I could watch a barn burn down and just ask somebody calmly if they'd called the fire department yet. So when Renee hung up that phone and looked at me the way you look at a man you've already decided is finished, I didn't ask her a single question. I just remembered it. That's a habit I picked up 6 years ago after Margaret died. I'll get to that. But I want you to understand something before this story goes any further. I am not a confused old man. I know exactly what day it is. I know exactly how much is in my checking account, what I paid for my truck, and what my property taxes were in 2019. I know all of that because I write it down. I have always written it down. What I didn't know that morning was how far my own children were willing to go to convince the rest of the family, and maybe even a judge that I didn't. 3 weeks before that phone call, my son Dennis had started helping me organize my bills. My daughter Renee had started coming to every doctor's appointment, sitting a little too close, answering questions the nurse had asked me. Small things. Things you could explain away, one at a time. But I've spent 40 years reading blueprints for a living. I know how to recognize when somebody's building something. And that morning, standing in my kitchen with a phone call still hanging in the air, I understood exactly what my children were building. They just didn't know what I'd already built first. I want to tell you a little about myself before we go further, because it matters for what comes later. I spent 41 years as a construction estimator, reading blueprints, catching mistakes before they became expensive, noticing the load-bearing wall someone forgot to mark. Margaret used to joke that I read grocery receipts the same careful way I read a set of house plans. She wasn't wrong. It's just how my mind works. It always has. I raised 3 children in this house, Dennis, Renee, and my youngest, Susan, who lives out west now and calls more than she visits. I buried my wife of 49 years in a cemetery 2 miles from where I'm sitting right now. I have coffee at 6 every morning, the same mug Margaret bought me the year Nixon resigned. And I have never once, not one single day since she passed, forgotten to lock the front door at night. So when I tell you my daughter looked at me that morning, like I was already gone, I want you to understand exactly how far from the truth that was. I should tell you about the binders, because they matter more than anything else in this story. When Margaret passed, I didn't fall apart the way people expected me to. I got quiet instead. And in that quiet, I found myself needing something to do with my hands in the evenings, the way I used to sand a cabinet door just to feel useful. So I started organizing. Every bank statement, every receipt, every letter from the county, from the insurance company, from the kids. Every photograph with a date written on the back in pencil, the way Margaret always did. I bought binders, plain black ones from the office supply store, and I labeled them by year, and I put everything in there in order, the way Margaret kept her recipe boxes. At first it was grief, then it became a habit, and somewhere along the way, without me deciding it on purpose, it became a record of my whole life, every dollar, every signature, every conversation I thought was worth remembering, written on an index card and slipped into the right month. My children thought it was sad. Dad's still organizing Mom's old paperwork, Renee told her husband once, not realizing I was in the next room. She wasn't wrong that it started with grief. She was wrong about everything else. Because those binders didn't just hold on to the past. They held on to the present too. Every bill I paid, every form I signed, every visit from every relative, dated and filed the same careful way. 6 years of it, 14 binders, sitting on a shelf in my study, in plain sight, that not one of my children had ever actually opened. That's the thing about people who think you're slipping. They stop looking at you closely enough to notice what you're actually doing. I kept the binders in my study on an open oak shelf Margaret had picked out herself, right beside our old sewing basket and a photograph of the two of us on our wedding day in 1972. Anyone who walked into that room could have pulled one down and flipped through it. Nobody ever did. Renee would poke her head in sometimes to ask if I needed anything dusted. Dennis would glance at the shelf and shake his head slightly. The way you shake. You're headed a man still keeping his late wife's coat in the closet. They saw grief. I understood that. Grief was easier for them to accept than discipline, easier to pity than to respect. So I let them believe what was comfortable. And I kept doing what actually mattered, writing the date at the top of every page. In the same steady hand I'd used my whole working life. Because a record with no date is just a pile of paper, and a record with a date is a timeline nobody can argue with. The first real crack showed up on a Tuesday, over dinner, over something so small I almost let it go. I was telling my grandson about a fishing trip I took with my father in 1961, a story I got told 100 times. One Margaret used to laugh at because I always added a different fish. Dennis cut me off halfway through. Dad, you told us that story last week, he said. Not unkind. Just flat, final. I hadn't told it last week. I checked my binder that night, out of habit, and found the last time. I told that particular story at a family dinner 11 months earlier, written in my own hand on a Sunday note card, the way I log most conversations worth remembering. I didn't correct Dennis. I just smiled and passed the potatoes. A week later, Renee started answering for me at my cardiologist's office. He forgets to mention his dizzy spells, she told the doctor. Though I hadn't had a dizzy spell in over a year. And the one time I had, it was because I skipped lunch, not because my mind was going anywhere. Small things. A correction here. A concerned glance there. The kind of thing that, on its own, looks like love, but I'd learned to notice patterns for a living, and patterns were exactly what I was starting to see. That same week, I noticed something else. Renee had started arriving 15 minutes before every doctor's appointment. Now, not the next morning, Dennis called to check in, which had become a daily habit over the past month. He asked what I'd had for breakfast, what medications I'd taken, whether I remembered our conversation from the day before. I answered every question accurately, calmly, the way I always did. Just want to make sure you're doing okay on your own, Dad, he said. I told him I was doing fine. I did not tell him that I'd started keeping a separate page just for these calls. The date, the time, the exact questions asked, worded almost identically every single time, like someone was building a file, because that's exactly what it felt like. Not concern, documentation. The only difference between what they were doing and what I was doing was that mine had 6 years of history behind it, and theirs had barely started. I remember sitting on my back porch that evening, the same porch Margaret and I had added on ourselves in 1988, mixing the concrete by hand because we couldn't afford to hire it out. I remember thinking that I had built half the things in this house with my own two hands, and raised two of the people now quietly discussing whether I was fit to manage my own life. And that somewhere between those two facts, something had gone very wrong. I didn't feel angry yet. That came later. What I felt that evening was closer to the quiet, careful feeling I used to get walking a job site before a big pour. The sense that something underneath the surface needed checking before anyone poured anything permanent on top of it. I found the name of the lawyer by accident, the way I found most things that mattered. Renee had left a folder on my kitchen table while helping me sort through bills, and in it, tucked behind a stack of real statements, was a business card for an elder law attorney 2 towns over, not the family lawyer we'd used for 30 years, but someone new, someone neither of my children had ever mentioned to me. I didn't say anything. I copied the name onto an index card, along with the date and where I'd found it, and slipped it into that year's binder. That evening, Dennis came by with paperwork he said was just routine. Updates to my power of attorney, he said, to make things easier if anything ever happened to me. He'd already filled in most of it. He just needed my signature. I read every line, the way I always do, and asked him a simple question. Why was a lawyer I'd never met listed as the drafting attorney? Dennis hesitated half a second too long before saying Renee had recommended him. I told him I'd like to review it with my own attorney first, the same man who'd handled Margaret's estate and knew this family's history better than anyone. Dennis's face changed, just for a moment, just enough, before he smiled and said, "Of course, no rush. Take your time." I did take my time. I made a copy of every page before I handed the original back to him. Then I called my real attorney the next morning and asked him to hold on to it for me, whatever they were building. I had just started building something of my own to stand against it. I want to be fair here, because fairness matters to me, even now. I don't believe Dennis set out that morning to hurt me. I think he told himself a story where signing that paperwork was simply practical, simply responsible, the way you tell yourself replacing a worn brake line was just maintenance. It's easier to do something you shouldn't when you've convinced yourself it was always going to happen, eventually anyway. But practical or not, he'd brought me a document drafted by a stranger, based on a conversation I was never part of, and asked for my signature before I'd had the chance to understand any of it. I signed nothing that night. I copied everything instead. And driving to my attorney's office the next morning, I remember feeling, for the first time in this whole affair, something closer to resolve than confusion, a sense that whatever came next, I would not be walking into it blind. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop, I want to be clear about that. I was simply walking past my own back porch with a cup of coffee when I heard Renee's voice through the screen door, low and certain, talking to Dennis on speaker. The doctor already said in the notes he's showing early signs. If we get the evaluation scheduled before Thanksgiving, we can have the guardianship filed by the new year. He won't even remember signing half of what we already have. I stood very still. My coffee didn't spill, which surprised me later, given how hard my hands were shaking. Early signs of what I wanted to ask? No doctor had ever told me that. No doctor had ever told them that either, as far as I knew, which meant either they were lying to each other, or somebody had written something in a file had never been shown. I didn't go inside. I didn't confront them. I went to my truck instead, sat in the driver's seat where nobody could see my face. And I wrote down every word I could remember while it was still fresh. The date, the time, the exact phrase he won't even remember signing, word for word. Then I did something I'd never done before. I called my doctor's office directly and requested a full copy of my own medical records. Every note, every visit, going back 3 years. If somebody had written a lie into my file, I intended to find it before they used it against me. I wanted to explain why I didn't simply call Renee and ask her directly. It would have been easier in some ways, but I'd learned something in 74 years that most people learn too late. Once you confront someone before you have the full picture, they stop leaving evidence behind. They get careful. They start covering instead of building. I wasn't ready to make them careful yet. I was still watching the shape of what they were building, and I intended to let it finish taking shape before I said a single word about it. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat at the kitchen table with Margaret's old radio playing low, the way she used to leave it on when she couldn't sleep either, and I read back through the last month of index cards, the fishing story, the dizzy spell that never happened, the word confused repeated at a birthday party, The lawyer's card, the paperwork Dennis had brought over, laid out together like that. In my own handwriting, in chronological order, it didn't look like a family worrying about an aging father anymore. It looked like a plan with a timeline, and I was the only person in the house who didn't yet know its final date. The records came 2 weeks later, 40 pages of them, and I read every line at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold beside me. There was nothing in there about early cognitive decline, nothing about memory concerns, nothing my actual doctor had written that matched a single word Renee had said on that call. What I did find was a single line, buried in the most recent visit, that hadn't been written by my doctor at all. A note added by a nurse practitioner I barely remembered meeting, stating that family reports increasing forgetfulness. Patient appears unaware. No test. No evaluation. Just a sentence. Apparently based on something my own daughter had told a nurse in a hallway while I was getting dressed after an exam. I called the office and asked, calmly, who had provided that information. The nurse, uncomfortable, admitted it had come from a conversation with my daughter, not from anything observed during my visit. I asked her to correct the record. She said she'd flag it for review. I didn't wait to see if she would. I made a copy of that page, highlighted the sentence in question, and wrote beside it, in my own hand, the date I'd requested the correction and the name of the person I'd spoken to. It went straight into the binder, right behind the index card about the lawyer, right behind the transcript of the phone call I wasn't supposed to hear. A pattern was no longer forming in my mind. It had already formed. I was simply collecting the proof of it. I called my primary doctor personally after that, a man who treated me for close to 15 years, and asked him directly whether he had ever, in any visit, observed a single sign of cognitive decline in me. He was quiet for a moment before answering. The way people get quiet when they realize they're being asked to defend a colleague's mistake. No, Harold, he said finally. Nothing like that has ever come up in your chart. Not from me. I asked him to put that in writing. He did. 2 days later, a short letter on his own letterhead, confirming there had never been any clinical concern about my memory or my capacity to manage my own affairs. That letter went into the folder too, right on top, because I understood. By then, that a single true sentence from a doctor who actually knew me was worth more than a dozen whispered concerns from people who only wanted to be believed. I found out at the family meeting from my granddaughter, Emily, who called me on a Sunday afternoon, sounding like she'd rather be doing anything else. Grandpa, she said, Mom and Uncle Dennis are getting everyone together next weekend. Aunt Susan's flying in. They're saying it's about your care? I asked her, as gently as I could, what exactly that meant. She hesitated. They want to talk about whether you should still be handling your own money. And the house, Emily was 26. The only one of my grandchildren who still called me every week just to talk, not to check on me. She'd been raised better than that, mostly by accident, since her mother, my other daughter, Susan, had moved across the country and missed most of the family's slow shift toward treating me like a problem to be managed. I thanked her for telling me. I told her not to worry, that I'd handle it. What I didn't tell her was that I'd already been handling it for 6 weeks, collecting documents, requesting records, copying every form Dennis had tried to get me to sign. What I didn't yet know was how far they intended to go at that meeting, or what exactly they were planning to put in front of me. I spent that week doing something I hadn't done in years. I went through every binder, all 14 of them, cover to cover, cross-referencing dates, pulling anything relevant to a single folder of its own. By the end of the week, that folder was over an inch thick. Whatever they were planning to say about me at that meeting, I intended to already have the answer written down, dated, and filed before they said it. I thought about calling Susan directly, my youngest, to hear the situation from someone who hadn't been shaping it for weeks. I decided against it, at least for the moment. If Renee and Dennis had already convinced her something was wrong before she ever landed at the airport, one phone call from me wasn't going to undo that on its own. Better, I decided, to let her walk into that meeting and watch the truth arrive in front of her, in order, the same way it had arrived in front of me, one document at a time, impossible to argue with once it was all laid out together. I also allowed myself that week to feel something I hadn't let myself feel yet. Not anger exactly. Something closer to sorrow for the family dinners that used to be simple. For the version of Dennis who used to call just to talk about the Tigers game. For the version of Renee who used to bring me Margaret's favorite casserole every October without being asked. I grieved that family quietly. The same way I grieved Margaret, and then I got back to work. 2 nights before the meeting, Emily showed up at my door unannounced, holding a grocery bag she didn't need to bring and a look on her face. I recognized from Margaret the look of someone who already suspects the truth and is afraid of confirming it. "Grandpa?" she said, sitting across from me at the kitchen table. "Can I ask you something honestly?" I told her she could always ask me anything. "Are you okay? Really?" Because mom keeps saying things and I don't know what to believe anymore. I looked at my granddaughter for a long moment before I stood up, walked into my study, and came back carrying one of the binders, the current year's, still half full. I set it in front of her and told her to open it. She did. Bank statements in order. Every bill paid on time, initialed, and dated. A page of medication logs I kept for my own peace of mind, matching exactly what my pharmacy would confirm. Photographs of every home repair I'd handled myself that spring, with receipts stapled beside them. "I've kept a record like this every year since your grandmother passed," I told her. "Ask me anything in there. Ask me any date." She flipped through page after page in silence, her eyes moving faster the further she went, until she reached the section from the past 6 weeks, the lawyer's card, the transcript of the phone call, the medical record with the highlighted line. She looked up at me, and I watched something in her face change permanently. "They don't know about this," she said. It wasn't a question. "No," I said. "They don't." Emily sat back in her chair for a long moment, and I watched her go through something I recognized. The particular grief of realizing the people you trusted most had been managing you rather than loving you. She asked me quietly why I hadn't told anyone sooner. Why I hadn't just confronted her mother the first time something felt wrong. I told her the truth. "Because the moment I say something," I said, "they stop showing me who they really are." She nodded slowly, the way Margaret used to nod when she decided something was settled in her mind. Before she left that night, she hugged me longer than usual at the door and told me she'd be there Saturday, sitting wherever I needed her to sit. I told her that was all I'd ever asked of her, not to fight for me, just to see clearly, and to remember what she saw. What I found 4 days before the family meeting was the thing that finally made my hands go cold. I'd asked my attorney to run a title search on my house just as a precaution, given everything else that had surfaced. He called me back sounding careful in a way lawyers only sound when they're about to tell you something you won't like. There was a quitclaim deed filed at the county recorder's office 3 weeks earlier, transferring partial ownership of my home into a trust I had never heard of, never agreed to, and never signed anything for. Except there was a signature on that deed, mine. I stared at the copy my attorney sent over for a long time. It was close. Close enough to fool a clerk at the recorder's office who didn't know my handwriting from anyone else's. Not close enough to fool me, or Margaret, who used to tease me about the particular way I looped my capital. I called my attorney back and asked him, very calmly, what our options were. He told me forging a property deed wasn't a family disagreement. It was a felony. I sat with that fact for a long time before I did anything about it. Not out of fear. Out of something closer to grief. The recognition that whoever had signed my name to that document had crossed a line I couldn't be quietly stepped back over, the way an insult or a whispered comment could. I made copies of the deed, the notary stamp, and the forged signature. I added them to the folder. I called Emily and asked her gently not to mention any of this before the weekend. Then I called my attorney one more time and asked him to clear his schedule for the following Saturday. I intended to attend that family meeting after all, just not the way they expected. That night, I sat alone in my study for a long time looking at the shelf of binders, at Margaret's photograph beside them, and I said something out loud to an empty room, the way I sometimes still do when a thing gets too heavy to carry silently. "I don't know how we raised someone who'd sign my name to something," I said, Nobody answered, of course. But saying it out loud in that room, surrounded by 14 years of careful proof that I had never once stopped paying attention to my own life, made the weight of it easier to carry into the days that followed. I spent the 2 days before the meeting the way I used to prepare for a job walkthrough. Back when I built things for a living, checking every measurement twice, making sure nothing could shift once the work began. I called my attorney and asked him to attend, quietly, waiting in his car outside until I called him in. I asked Emily to be there early, not as a witness for me exactly, but simply as someone in the room who already knew the truth, so I wouldn't be facing 13 strangers alone. I organized the folder one final time, the phone call transcript first, then the medical record, then the lawyer's card, then the forged deed, each behind a labeled tab, in the same order I intended to lay them on the table. I did not prepare a speech. I have never needed one. Margaret used to say the truth doesn't need decoration, it just needs a place to land. Saturday morning, I put on the shirt I would have worn to church, made a full pot of coffee for however many people showed up, and drove to Dennis's house myself, arriving 5 minutes early, the way I always have to everything in my life. Renee opened the door, looking briefly surprised that I'd come at all, as though some part of her had expected me to be too confused to remember. "Dad," she said, recovering quickly, warmly, the way she always did in front of others. "We're so glad you're here." I told her I was glad too. I meant it, in a way she wouldn't understand until later. Glad, finally, for the chance to say everything I'd been quietly collecting for 6 weeks, in front of everyone who needed to hear it. I carried the folder in with me. Nobody asked what it was. Not yet. The living room had been rearranged for the occasion, extra chairs brought in from the dining room, a pitcher of water on the coffee table, the whole scene staged the way you'd stage a room for an intervention, which I suppose in their minds is exactly what it was. Susan arrived a few minutes after me, hugging me a beat too long at the door, studying my face the way you study someone you've been told to worry about. My sister-in-law came in behind her, already looking at me with the particular gentle pity people reserve for the elderly and the unwell. I took my seat at the head of the table, the same seat I'd sat in for 30 years of family dinners, and I set the folder down in front of me without opening it. Emily sat to my left. My attorney waited outside in his car, exactly as we'd planned, ready when I called for him and not a moment before. It started the way I expected it to, gently, carefully, the way you'd approach someone you believed was fragile. Dennis spoke first, talking about how much they all loved me, how proud they were of everything I'd built, before pivoting, the way I'd known he would, into concern. He mentioned a few incidents. He mentioned the fishing story I'd supposedly repeated too soon. He mentioned dizzy spells that had never happened, memory lapses that existed only in conversations he'd had with Renee, never with me. Renee followed with the doctor's note, the one line, unverified, added by a nurse who'd only heard her side of things, reading it aloud like it was a diagnosis instead of a rumor with a signature attached. Then came the paperwork. A folder of their own slid across the table toward me, updated power of attorney, a guardianship petition already partially filled out, and finally, almost as an afterthought, a document confirming the trust that now apparently held partial title to my house. "We just want to make things easier," Renee said. The same words she'd used on the phone weeks earlier, before anything happens. I let the silence sit for a moment after she finished. I looked around the table at my children, my sister-in-law, my grandchildren, everyone waiting to see whether the confused old man in the room would simply sign where they pointed. Then I opened my own folder, and I began to speak. I looked at each of them in turn before I said anything. Dennis, still holding his own folder like a shield. Renee, dabbing at her eyes already, though nothing had happened yet to cry about. Susan, watching me with the wary hope of someone who wanted, more than anything, for this to turn out to be nothing. I thought of Margaret for a moment, of the way she used to say that the truth, when it finally comes, rarely needs to be loud. It just needs somebody willing to say it plainly, and not stop until it's finished. "I'd like to read something out loud," I said, before anyone signs anything. I pulled out the transcript first, the phone call from 6 weeks earlier, word for word, The sentence about the guardianship being filed by the new year. The sentence about me not remembering what I'd signed. The room went very still. Renee's face went pale in a way I hadn't seen since Margaret's funeral. I wrote this down the day I heard it. I said, date, time, exact words. I've been doing that for 6 years, actually. Writing things down. You might remember, he used to call it sad. That I kept your mother's old habit alive. I set the medical record on the table. Next, the highlighted line. The note about family reports and explained calmly that I'd called the office myself and confirmed exactly who had reported what, and that no doctor had ever evaluated me for anything of the kind. Dennis tried to speak. I raised one hand, not sharply, just enough to ask. I have the lawyer's card too, I said. The one I found on my own kitchen table. I called him myself, actually last week. He was very surprised to learn I hadn't authorized any of the paperwork with my name on it. Nobody at that table said a word. Even my sister-in-law, who'd flown in expecting to comfort a grieving, confused old man, was staring at the folder like it might catch fire. I hadn't even gotten to the deed yet. Susan had gone very quiet beside her sister, her hand pressed flat against her mouth, watching a version of her family come into focus that she hadn't been present for over the past year. I could see her doing the arithmetic in real time. Every phone call from Renee about keeping an eye on Dad. Every casual mention that I wasn't quite myself. All of it recontextualized in the space of a few minutes. Sitting at a table with a folder full of dates. My sister-in-law reached for her water glass and didn't drink from it. Nobody in that room was looking at me anymore. They were looking at the folder. The way you look at a door you suddenly suspect is about to open onto something you can't take back. I saved the deed for last, the way you save the heaviest board for the bottom of the stack, so everything above it holds steady. This one is harder for me, I said, and for the first time that morning, my voice actually did shake, just slightly. This is a copy of a quitclaim deed filed 3 weeks ago, transferring part ownership of my house into a trust none of you told me about. I slid it across the table. It has my signature on it, I said, except I never signed it. I nodded toward my attorney, who had been waiting quietly by the door the whole meeting, and asked him to step forward. He confirmed, in plain terms, that the signature had been reviewed and did not match decades of notarized documents on file, that the filing had already been reported to the recorder's office, and that forging a property transfer was a criminal matter, not a family disagreement. Renee started to cry. Dennis went white and said nothing at all, which told me more than anything he could have said. I'm not confused, I told the room quietly, the way I'd said everything else that morning. I have never once been confused. I have simply been paying attention. The way I've paid attention to everything since your mother died. Every bill, every letter, every conversation worth remembering. I looked at Emily, the only person in that room who wasn't surprised, and I felt something loosen in my chest that had been tight for 6 weeks. You didn't forget I kept records, I said, looking at Renee and Dennis both. You forgot I ever started? Susan was the first to move, crossing the room to kneel beside my chair, taking my hand in both of hers the way she used to when she was small and frightened of a thunderstorm. She didn't say anything at first, she just held on. My sister-in-law excused herself quietly to the kitchen, unable to look at any of us directly. My attorney gathered the documents back into order, calm and unhurried, the way professionals are when the hardest part of their job is already behind them. I sat there for a long moment in a room gone completely silent, feeling something I hadn't expected to feel at the end of all this. Not triumph, just a tired, settled kind of relief, feeling of finally setting down something heavy you've been carrying alone for far too long. The weeks that followed were not loud. I want to be honest about that because I know some of you are waiting for shouting, for someone thrown out of a house, for a courtroom scene with raised voices. It wasn't like that. It was quieter and in some ways harder. Dennis came to see me alone 3 days later and told me the trust had been Renee's idea, that a paralegal at the new lawyer's office had drafted the deed using an old signature card from years back, and that he'd gone along with it because he told himself it was temporary, that he'd fix it before it mattered. I told him it had already mattered. It had mattered the moment he decided my house was something to be divided before I was gone. Renee didn't come at all, not for weeks. When she finally did, it wasn't an apology so much as an accounting of her own fear of losing the house, of losing what she believed she was owed, of watching me grow old without a plan she'd been allowed to help build. I listen. I always listen. But listening isn't the same as forgetting, and I told her so. The deed was voided within the month. The recorder's office corrected the filing once the forgery was confirmed. The power of attorney paperwork was withdrawn before any judge ever saw it. My real attorney made sure of all of it, patiently, the way Margaret's estate had once been handled, carefully, and on the record. Emily stayed close the way she always had, only now without the shadow of doubt Renee had tried to plant in her. My sister-in-law called to apologize for the things she'd repeated without checking. Dennis, slowly, started showing up again. Not with paperwork, just with coffee, sitting across from me the way he used to before any of this began. I didn't need an apology to feel like I'd won something. I'd already won it 6 years earlier, one dated receipt at a time. Susan stayed an extra week that trip, longer than she'd planned. And we spent most evenings on the back porch Margaret and I had built with our own hands, not talking about any of it. Mostly just talking about her kids, about Margaret, about nothing in particular. It was the first time in over a year the silence between us had felt easy instead of careful. I won't pretend the family is exactly what it was before. Some things, once they happen, leave a line in the wood that never quite stands out. But there's coffee again on Sunday mornings, and there are phone calls that aren't disguised as check-ins, and there's finally a kind of honesty in this family that hadn't been there in a long time. The plain, unglamorous honesty of people who've stopped pretending they know better than the truth in front of them. People sometimes ask me now why I kept all those binders in the first place, whether some part of me always suspected my children might turn on me. I don't think that's true. I think I kept them because Margaret taught me, without ever meaning to, that love leaves a paper trail. Every letter she wrote me during my years overseas. Every recipe card in her handwriting. Every photograph with a date on the back so nobody would ever have to guess when a memory belonged. I didn't start keeping records because I distrusted my family. I started because I missed my wife, and organizing the evidence of a life felt like the only way to hold on to it. It just so happened that the same habit that helped me grieve her also protected me. Years later, from the people who assumed grief had made me careless instead of careful. I'm 74 years old. My memory is fine. My hands still shake sometimes when I write, but the words still land where I intend them to. And if my family ever doubts that again, I have 14 binders on a shelf in my study that will remind them, calmly and without a single raised voice, exactly what I remember and exactly what I don't forgive. Not out of spite, out of habit. The habit of a man who learned a long time ago that the people who love you leave proof of it behind. And so eventually do the people who don't. I still add to those binders every year, the way I have since 1988, right up through the past 6 months. Somewhere in that stack now sits a copy of a family meeting that didn't go the way anyone expected, filed the same careful way as everything else, dated, labeled, and put in its rightful place. No different in the end from a receipt for a fishing rod or a photograph from a wedding day. Just one more true thing, kept safe, in case anyone ever needed to remember it exactly as it happened. That's all I ever wanted, really. Not revenge. Just the truth, filed where it couldn't be lost.